The rain fell steadily over Manhattan that morning, turning the busy streets into a maze of gleaming reflections. Lynn checked her phone again, squinting at the time as she waited at another red light. 6:30 in the morning, and she was already behind on her pickups. The notification from her rideshare app blinked insistently, reminding her that her acceptance rate was dropping. She took a deep breath, trying to push away the worries that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The stack of unopened bills on her kitchen counter flashed through her mind, along with her younger sister's pale face as she lay in the hospital bed. The doctors had said the surgery couldn't wait much longer, but the insurance would only cover part of it. Every ride today meant another dollar toward that impossible-looking number. "You've got this," Lynn whispered to herself, a habit she'd picked up during these early morning shifts. Her old Toyota Camry hummed reassuringly beneath her, the engine's familiar sound almost drowning out the patter of rain on the roof. The car had seen better days, but it was reliable, just like she needed to be for her family right now. The streets were already filling up with the usual morning crowd. Coffee-clutching office workers dodged puddles on the sidewalks, while delivery trucks double-parked, their hazard lights creating amber reflections in the wet asphalt. Lynn navigated through it all with the expertise that came from months of driving these same routes, though the rain made everything more challenging. Her phone chimed again, another pickup request. This one was from the fancy side of town, where the buildings stretched so high they seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. These rides usually meant better tips, and Lynn couldn't afford to be picky today. She accepted the request, watching as the navigation recalculated her route. As she turned onto Madison Avenue, her mind wandered to last night's conversation with her sister. "Don't work too hard, big sis," she'd said, trying to smile despite the obvious pain. "I'll be fine." But Lynn knew better. The medical bills were just the beginning. There would be recovery time, physical therapy, and her sister would need someone to take care of her. Their parents were no longer around to help, and Lynn was all she had left. The windshield wipers squeaked across the glass, fighting against the increasing downpour. Lynn leaned forward slightly, straining to see through the rain-blurred windshield. The morning traffic was getting heavier, and she could feel the pressure building. 3 canceled rides already this morning. She couldn't afford another one. Her phone buzzed with a message from her passenger. "Running late for a meeting. Please hurry." Lynn's stomach tightened. She knew she shouldn't rush in this weather, but the thought of another canceled ride made her press the accelerator just a little harder. The cars ahead moved like a slow-motion dance, brake lights glowing red through the rain. She glanced down at her navigation app, checking the fastest route. That was when she heard the screech of brakes ahead. Her heart jumped into her throat as she looked up to see a sea of red brake lights. Everything seemed to slow down as her car hydroplaned, the steering wheel suddenly useless in her hands. Through the rain-streaked windshield, she caught a glimpse of something black and sleek directly in her path. In that fraction of a second, Lynn's mind raced through everything: her sister's medical bills, the rent due next week, the long hours she'd spent building up her perfect driver rating. Then reality caught up, and with it came the sickening sound of metal meeting metal. What happened next would change her life forever, though she didn't know it yet. As she sat there, hands frozen on the steering wheel, watching steam rise from her crumpled hood into the rain, Lynn had no idea that this moment, this terrible, heart-stopping moment, would become the turning point of her story. She didn't know that the expensive black car she'd just hit contained someone who would reshape her future. She didn't know that sometimes life's biggest opportunities come disguised as its worst disasters. All she knew was that the world had suddenly stopped spinning, and she needed to face whatever came next. The impact felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only seconds. Lynn's seatbelt dug into her shoulder as her car came to a sudden stop, the airbag deflating in front of her like a disappointed sigh. Through her windshield, now a spiderweb of cracks, she could see the expensive black Mercedes she'd just hit. Her stomach dropped to somewhere around her feet. The rain continued to fall, indifferent to the chaos it had helped create. Steam rose from both vehicles, mixing with the morning drizzle to create an eerie fog. Lynn's hands trembled as she tried to unbuckle her seatbelt, her fingers feeling numb and clumsy. The sound of car horns filled the air as impatient drivers tried to navigate around the accident. "Please be okay, she whispered to herself as she pushed her door open. Her legs felt wobbly as she stepped onto the wet pavement, her shoes immediately soaking through. The damage to her Camry's front end made her want to cry. There was no way she could afford to fix this. But right now, that wasn't her biggest concern. The Mercedes back door opened slowly, and Lynn's heart nearly stopped. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit emerged, one hand pressed against his shoulder. Even through the rain, she could tell this wasn't just any businessman. Everything about him, from his perfectly styled silver hair to his handmade leather shoes, screamed wealth and importance. She rushed forward, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. "I'm so sorry. Are you hurt? I didn't mean to, the rain. I couldn't stop in time." The words tumbled out in a panicked rush as she reached the man, who was now standing under a large black umbrella that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere, held by someone who must have been his driver. The man looked at her with surprisingly calm eyes, though his face showed signs of pain. He adjusted his shoulder slightly, wincing. "These things happen," he said, his voice carrying a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place, though perhaps not usually with quite such dramatic timing. Before Lynn could respond, she noticed movement all around them. People with cameras were appearing from seemingly nowhere, their equipment protected by clear plastic covers. The clicking of camera shutters mixed with the patter of rain and the continuing chorus of car horns. Someone shouted a question she couldn't quite make out. "Mr. Chen, are you all right? Was this an assassination attempt? What about the renewable energy announcement? Is this related to the tech merger?" The questions came rapid fire, and Lynn felt her world tilting sideways. Chen? As in Richard Chen, the tech billionaire who'd been all over the news lately. The same Richard Chen whose latest company had just revolutionized solar energy storage. She'd just crushed into one of the most powerful men in the world. Her legs threatened to give out as the full weight of the situation hit her. This wasn't just a simple fender bender anymore. This was the kind of accident that could ruin lives, specifically her life. She could already imagine the headlines. Rideshare driver attacks tech billionaire. Her insurance would never cover this. She'd lose her job, her ability to help her sister, everything. The man's security team was moving in now, creating a protective circle around him. One of them, a woman in a dark suit who somehow managed to look completely dry despite the rain, stepped toward Lynn with a stern expression. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and provide your information to the police." But Mr. Chen raised his hand, stopping his security team's advance. He was looking at Lynn with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it curiosity? Amusement? The pain in his shoulder seemed momentarily forgotten as he studied her face. "Your car," he said, gesturing toward her battered Camry. "You use it for work?" Lynn nodded, water dripping from her hair into her eyes. "Yes, sir. I'm a rideshare driver." I was actually on my way to pick up a passenger when..." She trailed off, realizing how pathetic it all sounded. The police were arriving now, their sirens adding to the cacophony of the morning. Mr. Chen glanced at them, then back at Lynn. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly, as though he'd made a decision about something. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice cutting through the chaos around them. "Lynn," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lynn Wu." He nodded, as though confirming something to himself. "Well, Ms. Wu, it seems we have quite a situation here." He turned to his security team. "Make sure she doesn't leave. I want to speak with her after I talk to the police." The impact felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only seconds. Lynn's seatbelt dug into her shoulder as her car came to a sudden stop, the airbag deflating in front of her like a disappointed sigh. Through her windshield, now a spiderweb of cracks, she could see the expensive black Mercedes she'd just hit. Her stomach dropped to somewhere around her feet. The rain continued to fall, indifferent to the chaos it had helped create. Steam rose from both vehicles, mixing with the morning drizzle to create an eerie fog. Lynn's hands trembled as she tried to unbuckle her seatbelt, her fingers feeling numb and clumsy. The sound of car horns filled the air as impatient drivers tried to navigate around the accident. Please be okay, she whispered to herself as she pushed her door open. Her legs felt wobbly as she stepped onto the wet pavement, her shoes immediately soaking through. The damage to her Camry's front end made her want to cry. There was no way she could afford to fix this. But right now, that wasn't her biggest concern. The Mercedes back door opened slowly, and Lynn's heart nearly stopped. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit emerged, one hand pressed against his shoulder. Even through the rain, she could tell this wasn't just any businessman. Everything about him, from his perfectly styled silver hair to his handmade leather shoes, screamed wealth and importance. She rushed forward, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. "I'm so sorry. Are you hurt? I didn't mean to, the rain. I couldn't stop in time." The words tumbled out in a panicked rush as she reached the man, who was now standing under a large black umbrella that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere, held by someone who must have been his driver. The man looked at her with surprisingly calm eyes, though his face showed signs of pain. He adjusted his shoulder slightly, wincing. "These things happen," he said, his voice carrying a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place, though perhaps not usually with quite such dramatic timing. Before Lynn could respond, she noticed movement all around them. People with cameras were appearing from seemingly nowhere, their equipment protected by clear plastic covers. The clicking of camera shutters mixed with the patter of rain and the continuing chorus of car horns. Someone shouted a question she couldn't quite make out. "Mr. Chen, are you all right? Was this an assassination attempt? What about the renewable energy announcement? Is this related to the tech merger?" The questions came rapid fire, and Lynn felt her world tilting sideways. Chen? As in Richard Chen, the tech billionaire who'd been all over the news lately. The same Richard Chen whose latest company had just revolutionized solar energy storage. She'd just crushed into one of the most powerful men in the world. Her legs threatened to give out as the full weight of the situation hit her. This wasn't just a simple fender bender anymore. This was the kind of accident that could ruin lives, specifically her life. She could already imagine the headlines. Rideshare driver attacks tech billionaire. Her insurance would never cover this. She'd lose her job, her ability to help her sister, everything. The man's security team was moving in now, creating a protective circle around him. One of them, a woman in a dark suit who somehow managed to look completely dry despite the rain, stepped toward Lynn with a stern expression. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and provide your information to the police." But Mr. Chen raised his hand, stopping his security team's advance. He was looking at Lynn with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it curiosity? Amusement? The pain in his shoulder seemed momentarily forgotten as he studied her face. "Your car," he said, gesturing toward her battered Camry. "You use it for work?" Lynn nodded, water dripping from her hair into her eyes. "Yes, sir. I'm a rideshare driver." I was actually on my way to pick up a passenger when..." She trailed off, realizing how pathetic it all sounded. The police were arriving now, their sirens adding to the cacophony of the morning. Mr. Chen glanced at them, then back at Lynn. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly, as though he'd made a decision about something. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice cutting through the chaos around them. "Lynn," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lynn Wu." He nodded, as though confirming something to himself. "Well, Ms. Wu, it seems we have quite a situation here." He turned to his security team. "Make sure she doesn't leave. I want to speak with her after I talk to the police." Lynn stood there in the rain, watching as the billionaire walked away with his entourage, leaving her to wonder if this was the beginning of her complete downfall, or something else entirely. The cameras continued to flash around her, capturing what felt like the worst moment of her life. Little did she know it would turn out to be anything but. The next 30 minutes felt like an eternity to Lynn as she stood in the rain, watching police officers take measurements and photos of the accident scene. Her clothes were completely soaked now, but she barely noticed. Her mind was too busy racing through all the possible ways this situation could destroy her life. A young officer had taken her statement, his pen struggling to write on wet paper as she explained about the rain, the slick roads, and how she'd lost control. He seemed sympathetic, but Lynn knew sympathy wouldn't pay her bills or help her sister. She could see her rideshare app continuing to ping with notifications, each one representing money she desperately needed but couldn't earn now. The crowd of reporters had grown larger, held back by police tape, but still shouting questions. Their cameras remained focused on Mr. Chen, who was speaking with what appeared to be his lawyers near a sleek black SUV that had arrived shortly after the accident. Every now and then, he would glance in her direction, and each time, Lynn's heart would skip a beat. "Your insurance information has been processed," the officer told her, handing back her documents. But given who was involved, this might get complicated. He gave her a look that seemed to say he didn't envy her position. Lynn clutched her wet papers, trying to keep them from falling apart in her trembling hands. She watched as a tow truck began hooking up her Camry. There went her livelihood, being hauled away like so much scrap metal. The car had been her father's last gift to her before he passed away, and now it was just another piece of wreckage on a Manhattan street. A light tap on her shoulder made her jump. She turned to find the stern-faced security woman from earlier standing there, holding an umbrella over both of them. "Mr. Chen would like to speak with you now," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "Please follow me." Lynn's legs felt like lead as she followed the woman to the SUV. The reporters surged forward, their questions becoming a blur of noise. "Are you pressing charges, Mr. Chen? Was this a deliberate attack? What about the tech conference tomorrow?" The security team created a barrier, shielding both Lynn and Mr. Chen from the cameras. Up close, Lynn could see that the billionaire had changed into a dry suit jacket, though his shoulder still seemed to be bothering him. He gestured for her to join him under a large umbrella held by his driver. "Ms. Wu," he said, his voice surprisingly warm despite the circumstances. "I understand you work as a rideshare driver. How long have you been doing this?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected accusations, demands for compensation, maybe even threats of lawsuits, not small talk. "Almost 2 years now," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. I do other gigs too. Whatever I can to make ends meet." He nodded thoughtfully. "And today, you seemed in quite a hurry." Lynn felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wasn't going to cry in front of this man, who probably spent more on breakfast than she made in a month. "My sister," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "She needs surgery. Insurance won't cover all of it, so I've been working extra shifts. I was trying to keep my acceptance rate up, get more rides in." She trailed off, realizing how hollow her excuses must sound to someone like him. But Mr. Chen was looking at her with an expression that seemed almost understanding. He absently rubbed his injured shoulder, then glanced at the crowd of reporters still hovering nearby. "You know," he said, 20 years ago, I was driving a delivery van in the rain. Not so different from your situation. Hit a patch of black ice, crashed into a restaurant's front window." He smiled slightly at the memory. "The owner could have pressed charges, ruined my life. Instead, he gave me a job in his kitchen. Said anyone who could make such a dramatic entrance deserved a chance to prove themselves." Lynn stayed at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. Was he the press out there? He continued, gesturing to the reporters. "They're expecting me to either have you arrested or sue you into oblivion. It would make for good headlines." He paused, studying her face. "But I've found that the best headlines often come from unexpected decisions." He turned to his assistant, who had materialized beside him with a tablet. "Get me the details on our transportation safety initiative. The one we've been struggling to get off the ground." He looked back at Lynn. "How would you feel about helping us understand the real challenges drivers face every day? Not from behind a desk, but from actual experience." Lynn's mind went blank. Was he offering her a job? This had to be a dream. Maybe she hit her head in the crash and was hallucinating all of this. But I just crashed into your car," she stammered. "I could have seriously hurt you." Mr. Chen smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "Sometimes the best insights come from our mistakes, Ms. Wu. Besides," he added, glancing at the remains of her Camry being loaded onto the tow truck, "it looks like you might be in need of a new career opportunity." The rain was finally starting to let up, and a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, catching on the wet pavement. Lynn stood there, dripping wet in her ruined clothes, as the world she thought was ending began to reshape itself into something entirely new and unexpected. The next few hours passed in a blur. Lynn found herself sitting in a leather chair so comfortable it made her forget about her still damp clothes in a conference room high above Manhattan. The entire wall of windows showed the city spreading out below, the morning's rain clouds now giving way to patches of blue sky. She clutched a cup of hot tea, trying to process everything that had happened since the accident. The police had finished their report. Her car was being taken to a repair shop, all expenses covered, Mr. Chen's assistant had assured her. And now, somehow, she was sitting in the headquarters of one of the world's largest tech companies, about to discuss a job she never could have imagined having. "Sorry to keep you waiting," Mr. Chen said as he walked in, his arm now in a sling but his steps still energetic. Behind him came several people in business attire, carrying tablets and looking curiously at Lin. "My medical team insisted on checking the shoulder. Nothing serious, just a mild sprain." Lin started to apologize again, but he waved it away with his good arm. "Please, no more apologies. Let's talk about something more important." He settled into a chair across from her, wincing slightly as he adjusted his position. "Tell me, in your experience as a driver, what's the biggest problem with our current transportation system?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected more paperwork, maybe some kind of settlement agreement. Not this. But as she looked at the expectant faces around her, she realized they were genuinely interested in her answer. "Well," she began slowly, gathering her thoughts, "it's not just one thing. It's like everything's disconnected. The apps don't talk to each other. Traffic patterns aren't properly shared. Weather warnings come too late." She thought about all the times she'd struggled to make smart decisions on the road. And the pressure, the constant pressure to maintain ratings, accept rides, make enough money. It makes people take risks they shouldn't. Mr. Chen leaned forward, his eyes lighting up. "Exactly. That's exactly what we've been trying to explain to our development team." He turned to one of his colleagues. "You see, this is the perspective we've been missing." The next hour flew by as Lin found herself explaining the daily challenges of being a driver in the city. She talked about the impossible pickup spots, the navigation systems that didn't account for real-world conditions, the way weather could throw everything into chaos. To her surprise, people were taking notes, asking questions, treating her like some kind of expert. "Your sister's surgery," Mr. Chen said during a brief break, his voice quieter so others couldn't hear. "When is it scheduled?" Lin's heart clenched. With everything that had happened, she'd almost forgotten about that pressing reality. "Next month," she whispered. "But I don't know how I'll—" "It's taken care of," he said simply. "Consider it part of your signing bonus." She stared at him, not quite comprehending. "My, what?" He smiled, that same warm smile that seemed to transform his whole face. "We're offering you a position as our Transportation Safety Initiative Coordinator. Full benefits, of course, including comprehensive family health coverage." He paused, watching her face. "Unless you prefer to go back to driving rideshare." Lin felt tears welling up in her eyes again, but this time she didn't try to hold them back. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied. "We need someone who understands the real world, not just the theory. Someone who knows what it's like out there on the streets, who understands the pressures drivers face." He gestured to the window, to the city sprawling below. "Someone who can help us make it better." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mr. Chen's assistant entered with more papers, actual employment documents this time. As Lin began to read through them, she couldn't help but think about how differently this day had turned out from what she'd feared. "Oh, and one more thing," Mr. Chen added as he stood to leave. "About your car, we'll be replacing it. You'll need something reliable for your commute." He smiled again. "Though maybe not a Mercedes, at least not yet." The room filled with gentle laughter, and Lin found herself joining in. Just hours ago, she'd thought her life was over. Now, sitting in this tower high above the city, she realized it was actually just beginning. As she signed the last document, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her sister. "Haven't heard from you all morning. Everything okay?" Lin looked around the room, at the city beyond the windows, at the stack of papers that represented her new future. She texted back, "Everything's better than okay. Wait until you hear what happened." The afternoon sun broke through the last of the morning's rain clouds, flooding the conference room with warm light. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware that sometimes the worst accidents can lead to the best opportunities, and that sometimes a wrong turn can actually be the right one in disguise. The weeks flew by like pages in a book caught in the wind. Lynn's life had transformed so completely that sometimes she had to pinch herself to make sure she wasn't dreaming. Her tiny apartment was still the same, but everything else had changed. Her first day at the company had been overwhelming. The security badge with her photo on it, the sleek laptop they gave her, the desk with a view of the city, it all felt like she'd stepped into someone else's life. But then she opened her first email, a message from Mr. Chen himself, and found just 2 simple lines. "Remember why you're here. You know what needs to change." Those words became her anchor as she dove into her new role. In meetings where executives talked about profit margins and market share, she'd raise her hand and talk about the single parent trying to make enough money to feed their kids, or the student driver working between classes. She brought the real world into those pristine conference rooms, and to her surprise, people listened. "You see this intersection?" she'd say, pulling up traffic data on the huge screen in the meeting room. "The app says it's a perfect pickup point. But ask any driver, and they'll tell you it's a nightmare during rush hour. There's no safe place to stop, and the traffic light timing means you're stuck there for ages." The development team would scribble notes, ask questions, and gradually things began to change. Lynn's experiences as a driver became the foundation for new features, safer routes, better support systems. She worked longer hours than she ever had driving, but this time it was different. She was building something that would help thousands of people like her former self. Her sister's surgery went perfectly, thanks to the health coverage from her new job. Watching her sister take her first steps during physical therapy, Lynn couldn't help but think about how a single moment, even a terrible one, could change everything. One rainy morning, similar to that fateful day, Mr. Chen called her into his office. The sling was long gone, and he was back to his energetic self. "I want to show you something," he said, pulling up a presentation on his screen. "These are our safety statistics from the last 3 months." Lynn leaned forward, her eyes widening as she took in the numbers. Accident rates had dropped by 15%. Driver satisfaction was up. Stress-related incidents were down significantly. "Your changes," he said, "your insights, they're making a real difference." He switched to another screen, showing a map of the city with various colored dots and patterns. "This is your new routing system in action. Look at how much smoother the flow is." Lynn stared at the screen, remembering all the hours she'd spent explaining to the tech team about the real-world challenges drivers faced. How they'd worked together to create something that didn't just look good on paper, but actually worked on the streets. "We're presenting this at the International Transportation Safety Conference next month," Mr. Chen continued, watching her reaction. "And I want you to be the one to present it." Lynn's head snapped up. "Me? But I don't know how to." He smiled that now familiar warm smile. "You know this better than anyone. You lived it. And besides," he added with a slight smirk, "after hitting my car, speaking to a room full of transportation experts should be easy." They both laughed, the memory of their first meeting now transformed from a disaster into something more like destiny. Lynn looked out the office window at the city below, watching the streams of traffic flowing through the streets like rivers. Somewhere down there, other drivers were facing the same challenges she once had. But now, because of that rainy morning and that terrible accident, she was in a position to help them. "Okay," she said, turning back to Mr. Chen. "I'll do it, but I want to make it real. No fancy corporate speak, just the truth about what drivers need and how we can help them." He nodded approvingly. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you." He paused, then added, "You know, when you crashed into my car that day, my security team thought it was an assassination attempt." He chuckled. "Instead, it turned out to be exactly what this company needed, a wake-up call." Lynn smiled, remembering how terrified she'd been that morning. "I guess sometimes the worst moments in our lives can turn into the best opportunities." "Indeed," Mr. Chen agreed. "Though maybe next time just send a resume instead of crashing into my car." As they laughed together, Lynn's phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the company's new driver app, the one she'd helped design. A driver had just sent in feedback. "Finally, someone who understands what we need." "Thank you." Lynn felt her heart swell with pride. She'd gone from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. And somehow, against all odds, a car accident had turned into the best wrong turn she'd ever made. The International Transportation Safety Conference loomed ahead like a mountain Lynn had to climb. She spent weeks preparing, staying late at the office, practicing her presentation in empty conference rooms. Each time she rehearsed, she thought about all the drivers out there who needed someone to speak for them. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror the morning of the conference, Lynn barely recognized herself. Gone was the tired rideshare driver in a worn jacket. Instead, she saw a confident professional in a well-fitted suit. Her sister had helped her pick it out, insisting that she needed to look the part. "You're going to do great," her sister had said while helping her choose accessories. "You've lived this story. Just tell it like it is." Her sister, now fully recovered from surgery, had become her biggest cheerleader. The conference center was packed with industry leaders, tech experts, and transportation officials from around the world. Lynn's hands trembled slightly as she checked her presentation notes one last time backstage. Mr. Chen found her there, looking as calm as ever in his signature style. "Nervous?" he asked, adjusting his tie. Lynn nodded. "There are over 1,000 people out there. CEOs, experts, people who've been in this industry for decades. What if they don't take me seriously?" He smiled, that same warm smile she'd come to know well. "Tell me something," he said, leaning against the wall. "How many of them have actually driven for a living? How many understand what it's like to worry about ratings and acceptance rates while trying to stay safe on rainy roads?" She thought about it. Probably not many. "Exactly. That's your strength, not your weakness. You're not just another suit with a PowerPoint presentation. You're someone who's lived this reality." He checked his watch. "Ready?" The lights in the auditorium dimmed as Lynn took the stage. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought the microphone might pick it up. But when she looked out at the sea of faces, she didn't see intimidating executives anymore. She saw an opportunity to make a difference. "6 months ago," she began, her voice steadier than she expected, "I was a rideshare driver struggling to make ends meet. Today, I'm here to tell you how a car accident changed not just my life, but potentially the lives of millions of drivers around the world." The room grew quiet as she spoke. She told them about the real challenges drivers faced, not with fancy statistics, but with real stories. She showed them the changes her team had implemented, the results they'd achieved, and the lessons they'd learned. "We discovered something surprising," she continued, clicking to her next slide. "When you actually listen to drivers, when you understand their daily struggles, you can create solutions that work in the real world, not just in theory." She showed them the new safety features they'd developed, the improved routing systems, the stress reduction protocols. But more importantly, she showed them the human impact, stories of drivers who could now work safely while still making a living wage. "This isn't just about technology," she said, nearing the end of her presentation. "It's about understanding that behind every steering wheel is a human being with hopes, dreams, and responsibilities. When we forget that, we fail. When we remember it, we can transform an entire industry." The applause that followed her final words was deafening. But what meant more were the faces she saw in the audience. People nodding, taking notes, actually listening. She'd given voice to thousands of drivers who'd never had a chance to speak in rooms like this. After the presentation, people crowded around her, asking questions, sharing their own ideas. A transportation official from another country wanted to implement similar programs. A tech startup founder asked about collaboration opportunities. Even skeptics seemed impressed by the real-world results they'd achieved. Mr. Chen found her during the reception, beaming with pride. "You did it," he said, handing her a glass of sparkling water, "and this is just the beginning." "The beginning?" Lynn asked, surprised. "What do you mean?" He gestured to the room full of industry leaders, all buzzing with excitement about the ideas she'd presented. "Look around. You've started something here. A movement to make transportation safer and more humane. Other companies will follow our lead. More drivers will benefit. More lives will be saved." Lynn felt overwhelmed by the possibility. "All because of a car accident in the rain?" "No," he corrected her. "All because you had the courage to turn that accident into an opportunity. To speak up, to make changes, to fight for what drivers really need." He raised his glass. "To wrong turns that lead us in the right direction." Later that evening, as Lynn packed up her presentation materials, she found a note on her laptop. It was from one of the conference attendees, a former taxi driver who'd become a transportation consultant. The note read, "Thank you for remembering us. Thank you for making our voices heard." She carefully folded the note and put it in her pocket, a reminder that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest contributions. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in those streets, countless drivers were safer because one rainy morning, everything had gone wrong in exactly the right way. Later that evening, as Lynn packed up her presentation materials, she found a note on her laptop. It was from one of the conference attendees, a former taxi driver who'd become a transportation consultant. The note read, "Thank you for remembering us. Thank you for making our voices heard." She carefully folded the note and put it in her pocket, a reminder that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead. 1 year had passed since that rainy morning when Lynn's car crashed into a billionaire's Mercedes. She stood at her office window, watching the sunrise paint the city's skyline in shades of gold and pink. On her desk sat today's newspaper, featuring a headline she still couldn't quite believe: "Revolutionary Driver Safety Program Goes Global." The article detailed how their safety initiatives had spread to transportation companies worldwide. What had started as one person's mistake had grown into something that was changing lives across the globe. Lynn picked up the paper, running her fingers over the words as if to make sure they were real. Her phone buzzed, a message from her sister. "Turn on the news. They're talking about you again." Lynn smiled, remembering how different their lives had been just a year ago. Her sister was now fully recovered and back at work, teaching at a local school. The medical bills that had once seemed impossible were long paid off. The morning news was indeed featuring their latest achievement, a new AI-driven safety system that could predict and prevent accidents before they happened. The reporter was interviewing drivers about the changes they'd seen. "It's like having someone looking out for us," one driver said on screen. "The app knows when we're tired, when conditions are dangerous. It's not just about making money anymore, it's about keeping us safe." A knock at her office door interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Chen entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee, their morning ritual now. "Watching your handiwork?" he asked, nodding toward the TV. "Still can't believe it sometimes," Lynn admitted, accepting the coffee. "A year ago, I was just trying to make enough money to help my sister. Now you're helping thousands of families," he finished. "Though I have to admit, your method of getting my attention was rather dramatic." They'd both laughed at what had become a running joke between them. The morning sun streamed through the window as they discussed the day ahead. There was a meeting with transportation officials from Europe, eager to implement their safety programs. A video conference with tech teams in Asia working on localized versions of their driver support systems. And most exciting of all, the launch of their driver education initiative. "Remember what you told me that first day?" Mr. Chen asked, settling into one of the chairs in her office. "About the pressure drivers feel? How it makes them take risks they shouldn't?" Lynn nodded. Those feelings were still vivid in her memory, though they seemed like they belonged to another lifetime now. "Well, look at this," he said, pulling up a report on his tablet. The numbers showed a dramatic decrease in accident rates across cities where their program had been implemented. Driver satisfaction scores were at all-time highs. Emergency response times had improved by 40%. "But these aren't just numbers," Lynn said, thinking of all the faces behind the statistics. "Each one of these represents a real person. A family that doesn't have to worry so much. A driver who can return home safely." Her computer chimed with a new email, another city wanting to adopt their safety program. As she read through the request, she thought about how one moment could change everything. How sometimes the worst day of your life could turn into the best thing that ever happened to you. The intercom buzzed. Her assistant reminded her about the morning's first meeting. A group of young entrepreneurs wanting to learn from their success story. Lynn gathered her materials, including the presentation she prepared. Its first slide showed a simple photo, a crashed car in the rain. "You still use that picture?" Mr. Chen asked, raising an eyebrow. "Always," Lynn replied. "It reminds me where we started, how sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest achievements." As they walked to the conference room, they passed the wall of photos in the hallway, news clippings, awards, recognition from around the world. But Lynn's favorite was the smallest one. A simple thank you note from a driver whose life had been saved by their safety systems. The meeting room was full of eager faces, young innovators ready to learn and change the world. Lynn took her place at the front, thinking about how far she'd come from that terrifying morning in the rain. "Let me tell you a story," she began, her voice confident and clear. "It's about how sometimes life's biggest disasters can turn into our greatest opportunities. It's about how one wrong turn can lead us exactly where we need to be." Outside, the city hummed with morning traffic. Thousands of drivers navigated the streets, protected by systems she'd helped create. Somewhere out there, another driver might be having a bad day, facing challenges that seemed insurmountable. But now, thanks to one rainy morning and one life-changing accident, they had a better chance of making it home safely. Lynn looked at the young faces before her, eager to make their own mark on the world. "Remember," she told them, "it's not about avoiding mistakes. It's about what you choose to do with them that matters." And in that moment, standing in front of a room full of future innovators, Lynn knew that her story was more than just a tale of an accident turned opportunity. It was proof that sometimes life's wrong turns could lead to exactly the right destination to our greatest contributions. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in those streets, countless drivers were safer because one rainy morning, everything had gone wrong in exactly the right way.